Sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in plain sight. They board planes like everyone else, carry simple bags, and sit quietly in middle seats. They don't wear uniforms or badges that scream their achievements. They simply exist among us, carrying decades of service and sacrifice that most will never know about. On a routine commercial flight from Seattle to Washington, D.C., passengers settling into their seats had no idea they were sharing cabin space with someone who had shattered barriers, commanded respect in the most elite military circles, and earned call signs that still echo through Air Force bases worldwide. She looked like any other traveler, a woman in her 60s, neatly dressed, reading quietly in seat 13F. But when turbulence hit and radio chatter from nearby F-22 Raptor pilots accidentally bled through the plane's communication system, everything changed. A call sign crackled through the static, a name that made hardened fighter pilots straighten their spines and show reverence reserved for legends. The woman in 13F never moved, never acknowledged the sudden shift in energy around her. She simply continued reading, as if she hadn't just been revealed as one of the most groundbreaking aviators in military history. This is her story, one of breaking sound barriers and glass ceilings, of earning respect in a world that never expected her to soar, and of the quiet dignity that follows true pioneers long after their flying days are done. The Boeing 737 taxied down the runway at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport on a gray Tuesday morning in March. Flight 447 to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport carried the usual mix of business travelers, tourists, and government workers making the cross-country journey. Among them, tucked into seat 13F, sat Colonel Sarah Mitchell, though none of her fellow passengers knew her rank or the history she carried. Sarah had deliberately chosen the middle seat. After 32 years in the Air Force, she had learned the value of staying unnoticed when she wanted to travel in peace. The window seat passenger, a young tech worker for Microsoft, was already absorbed in his laptop. The aisle seat held a middle-aged businessman who had fallen asleep before takeoff. Perfect. Sarah opened her worn paperback novel and settled in for the 5-hour flight. At 63, Sarah moved with the quiet confidence that comes from a lifetime of breaking barriers. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore civilian clothes, a navy blazer, white blouse, and slacks. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had spent decades commanding fighter squadrons, testing experimental aircraft, or earning call signs that were spoken with reverence in military circles worldwide. The flight attendant, Jennifer, a cheerful woman in her 40s, moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. She noticed the woman in 13F had declined the airline magazine, was reading an actual book instead of staring at a phone, and had the straightest posture she had seen all day. There was something different about her, though Jennifer could not quite place what it was. As the plane reached cruising altitude over the Cascade Mountains, Sarah allowed her mind to wander. She was heading to Washington, D.C. for a reunion she had been avoiding for years. The Women Military Aviators Association was honoring the pioneers, the first women to break into combat roles, to command fighter squadrons, to prove that the sky belonged to everyone willing to earn their wings. Sarah had been instrumental in opening those doors, but she preferred to let others take the spotlight. The young man beside her shifted, accidentally bumping her arm. "Sorry," he mumbled, glancing over. For a moment, his eyes lingered on her hands. They were not the soft hands of someone who had spent their career behind a desk. These were the hands of a pilot, steady, precise, with faint scars from years of working around aircraft machinery. Her watch was military issue, though an older model that most civilians would not recognize. "No problem," Sarah replied with a smile, returning to her book. She was reading a biography of Chuck Yeager, though she could have written her own chapters about the test pilot program. She had known Chuck personally, had flown aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible, and had earned her place in a brotherhood that had never expected to include sisters. The businessman in the aisle seat stirred awake as the plane hit a patch of rough air over the Rocky Mountains. He glanced around, noting his fellow passengers with the detached interest of someone who traveled frequently. The woman in the middle seemed remarkably calm despite the turbulence. While others gripped their armrests or looked anxiously out windows, she continued reading as if the aircraft's movements were as natural as breathing. What the businessman could not know was that Sarah had experienced turbulence that would terrify most people. She had flown through thunderstorms that felt like being inside a paint mixer, had navigated aircraft through combat zones where turbulence was the least of her worries, and had test-piloted experimental jets that shook so violently the instruments blurred. Commercial airline turbulence felt like a gentle massage by comparison. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some moderate chop as we cross over the Rockies. We have been cleared to climb to 39,000 feet to try to find smoother air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Sarah recognized something in the pilot's voice, the calm professionalism that came from military training. She had heard that tone thousands of times, had used it herself when addressing crews before dangerous missions. This was a pilot who had learned to command confidence even when facing uncertainty. The tech worker beside her finally looked up from his laptop as the turbulence intensified. "You seem really calm about this," he said, noting how Sarah had not even gripped her armrests. "Flying is safer than driving," Sarah replied simply. "The pilots know what they are doing." If only he knew how much she understood about what the pilots were doing. Sarah had logged over 4,000 flight hours in her career, had commanded squadrons of pilots, and had been responsible for training aviators who went on to become legends themselves. She understood every sound the aircraft made, every vibration, every subtle change in engine tone that indicated what was happening in the cockpit. As the plane climbed to the higher altitude, Sarah's thoughts drifted to her early days in the Air Force. She had enlisted in 1982 when women were still prohibited from combat roles. The military was slowly opening opportunities for female pilots, but the resistance was fierce. Many believed women lacked the physical strength, mental toughness, or emotional stability to handle high-performance aircraft. Sarah had proven them wrong, one flight at a time. Her first assignment was flying transport aircraft, large, unglamorous planes that carried supplies and personnel. While her male counterparts dreamed of fighter jets and combat missions, Sarah focused on becoming the best pilot she could be, regardless of the aircraft type. She studied harder, trained longer, and maintained standards that impressed even her harshest critics. The breakthrough came in 1993 when combat exclusion laws were finally lifted. Sarah was among the first women selected for fighter pilot training, and she approached it with the same methodical determination that had defined her career. The training was brutal, physically, mentally, and emotionally. She was scrutinized more closely than her male classmates, held to higher standards, and had to prove herself repeatedly. But Sarah had thrived under pressure her entire life. The businessman in the aisle seat ordered another coffee from Jennifer, who was making her way through the cabin despite the continued turbulence. As she served drinks, Jennifer found herself repeatedly glancing at the woman in 13F. There was something almost regal about her composure, a quality that suggested she had faced far more challenging situations than airplane turbulence. "Can I get you anything?" Jennifer asked when she reached Sarah's row. "Just water, please," Sarah replied. "Thank you." Even her voice carried authority, though it was softly spoken. Jennifer had served thousands of passengers over her 15-year career, and she had developed an ability to read people. This woman was different, not demanding or entitled like some first-class passengers who ended up in coach, but different in a way that suggested depth, experience, and stories that would be fascinating to hear. The turbulence finally subsided as the aircraft found the smoother air at 39,000 feet. The seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers began moving about the cabin. Sarah remained seated, continuing to read, though she found herself thinking more about her past than focusing on the words on the page. Her call sign had been Phoenix, earned during a training exercise when she had recovered from what should have been a fatal aircraft malfunction. The incident had happened during advanced fighter training, when Sarah was flying an F-16 through high-speed maneuvers over the Nevada desert. A hydraulic failure had sent the aircraft into an uncontrolled spin at 15,000 feet. Most pilots would have ejected immediately. The training manuals recommended ejection for that type of failure. But Sarah had spent precious seconds analyzing the problem, using techniques she had learned from studying every aircraft accident report she could find. She had managed to regain control at 3,000 feet, barely above the minimum safe altitude. The instructors had been speechless. The recovery was textbook perfect, executed under conditions that should have been impossible to overcome. Word spread quickly through the fighter pilot community. Sarah Mitchell had not just saved an expensive aircraft. She had demonstrated the kind of cool-headed thinking that separated good pilots from exceptional ones. Phoenix became her call sign because she had literally risen from what should have been ashes. The name followed her through her career as she moved from training to operational squadrons. She flew combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, commanded fighter wings, and eventually became one of the youngest colonels in the Air Force. Her expertise was sought by aircraft manufacturers. Her opinions carried weight in Pentagon discussions about future aviation technology, and her recommendations shaped training programs that produced the next generation of elite pilots. But Sarah had never sought fame or recognition outside military circles. She had done her job, broken barriers when necessary, and quietly paved the way for other women to follow. When she retired 3 years earlier, there had been ceremonies and awards, but she had preferred to fade into the background of civilian life. The young tech worker beside her was now watching a movie on his laptop, occasionally glancing over as if trying to figure out what made his seatmate so intriguingly composed. Sarah noticed his curiosity, but had become expert at deflecting personal questions during her years in service. People were naturally curious about her experiences, but most stories from her career were classified, dangerous to share, or simply too complex for casual conversation. As the plane crossed into Kansas airspace, Sarah reflected on how different this journey was from her last flight in military aircraft. That had been in an F-22 Raptor, the Air Force's most advanced fighter jet, during a farewell flight arranged by her squadron. The F-22 was a machine that represented the absolute pinnacle of aviation technology, capable of supersonic speeds, nearly invisible to radar, and equipped with weapons systems that could engage multiple targets simultaneously. Flying the F-22 had been like piloting a spacecraft. The aircraft responded to thought as much as physical input, its computer systems processing information faster than human reflexes could follow. Sarah had been among the select few pilots qualified to fly the Raptor operationally, and even fewer had commanded squadrons equipped with the revolutionary fighter. Now, she was traveling at a fraction of that speed, in a commercial aircraft that prioritized passenger comfort over performance. Yet she found peace in the simplicity of being just another traveler, reading quietly while others around her worried about arrival times, connecting flights, or work meetings. The businessman in the aisle seat was now on his phone, making calls related to some urgent business matter. His stressed voice carried despite his attempts to speak quietly, and Sarah could hear him discussing contracts, deadlines, and personnel problems. She recognized the tone. It was the same stressed urgency she had heard from junior officers when they faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. Sarah had learned long ago that most problems, no matter how urgent they seemed, could be solved with clear thinking, careful planning, and steady execution. Combat had taught her to prioritize threats, make decisions quickly, and remain calm when others panicked. Those skills had translated well to military leadership and had served her throughout civilian life as well. The flight was now over Nebraska, with still hours remaining before reaching Washington, D.C. Sarah closed her book and allowed herself to doze lightly, the kind of rest that military training had taught her to achieve anywhere, anytime. She could sleep on cargo planes, in cockpits during long missions, or in uncomfortable chairs while waiting for weather to clear. As she rested, Sarah did not know that her peaceful journey was about to be interrupted in a way that would remind everyone aboard exactly who was sitting quietly in seat 13F. The first sign that something unusual was happening came through the aircraft's speaker system as Flight 447 crossed into Missouri airspace. What began as routine background static suddenly carried fragments of radio communication that should not have been audible to commercial passengers. Raptor 2-1, adjust heading to 270, came a crisp, professional voice through the cabin speakers. Captain Mike Torres, piloting the Boeing 737, immediately recognized the communication as military air traffic control coordinating with F-22 Raptor fighters. Such coordination was not uncommon near military installations, but the radio frequency bleeding through to passenger cabin speakers was unusual. He made a mental note to have maintenance check the communication systems when they landed. Sarah's eyes opened immediately. She had been dozing lightly, but the sound of F-22 coordination chatter brought her to full alertness. After decades in military aviation, she could identify aircraft types, mission parameters, and tactical situations from radio communications alone. The F-22s were conducting what sounded like a training exercise, probably out of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. The young tech worker beside her looked confused. "What was that?" he asked. "Just radio interference," Sarah replied, though she was now listening intently to every sound coming through the speaker system. The businessman in the aisle seat had paused his phone conversation, also puzzled by the military chatter that continued to intermittently break through the aircraft's communication system. Most passengers seemed to dismiss it as technical difficulties, but a few were beginning to pay attention. Jennifer, the flight attendant, approached the cockpit to inquire about the radio interference. As she walked up the aisle, more military communication crackled through the speakers, clearer this time. "Raptor 2-3, you are cleared for high-speed pass. Maintain Angels 20. Sarah's hands tightened slightly on her book. She knew that terminology, had used it countless times herself. The F-22s were at 20,000 feet, conducting high-speed training maneuvers. The exercise sounded routine, but something in the air traffic controller's tone suggested they were dealing with multiple aircraft in a complex training scenario. Captain Torres was now actively working to isolate the frequency bleed, but the interference was proving persistent. As a former Navy pilot himself, he was not concerned about the military training exercise happening in the area. Military and civilian aircraft shared airspace regularly, with careful coordination to ensure safety. However, he was concerned about passenger anxiety if the radio chatter continued. The next transmission came through even clearer, and this time it carried information that made Sarah's heart rate increase slightly. "All Raptor flights, be advised we have a civilian aircraft in your training area, Boeing 737, commercial flight. Maintain safe separation and continue exercise." Now, Sarah was paying close attention. Flight 447 was apparently close enough to the F-22 training exercise that air traffic control was actively coordinating between military and civilian aircraft. She looked out the window, but could not see the fighters. F-22s were designed to be nearly invisible, both to radar and visual detection. The tech worker was now staring at the speakers with obvious concern. "Are we in danger?" he asked. "No, sarà riplaid fermly." Military and civilian aircraft train and operate in shared airspace all the time. Air traffic control manages separation very carefully. Her authoritative tone seemed to calm not just him, but several other passengers who had overheard. There was something in her voice that conveyed knowledge and confidence, though they had no way of knowing the depth of her expertise. The radio chatter continued, and Sarah found herself unconsciously analyzing the tactical situation. The F-22s were practicing intercept maneuvers, probably simulating air-to-air combat scenarios. She could hear at least 4 different aircraft call signs, indicating a substantial training exercise involving multiple fighters. Then came a transmission that changed everything. "Raptor Lead, this is Control. Please confirm your current position relative to civilian traffic." The response came back immediately, professional and precise. Control, Raptor lead. We have visual on the Boeing 737. Maintaining safe separation as instructed. There was a brief pause, then another voice came through the radio, younger, probably a wingman in the formation. Control, Raptor 24. The civilian aircraft. Can you confirm the flight number and destination? Sarah frowned. That was an unusual question. Military pilots conducting training exercises typically did not need specific information about civilian flights, as long as separation was maintained. The air traffic controller's response was routine. Raptor 24, civilian traffic is Flight 447, Seattle to Reagan National. Another pause, longer this time. Then came a transmission that made Sarah's blood run cold. Control, did you say Reagan National? Can you stand by? The radio went quiet for several long seconds. Passengers throughout the cabin were now listening intently, sensing that something significant was happening. The businessman had ended his phone call and was leaning forward, trying to understand the military communication. When the next transmission came, it was in a different voice entirely. Older, with the unmistakable authority of a senior officer. Control, this is Colonel Peterson, Raptor lead. I need to confirm something. Flight 447, Boeing 737, Seattle to Reagan National. Do you have any information about passengers on board? Sarah's heart stopped. She recognized that voice. Colonel James Peterson had been her wingman years earlier, before he became one of the most respected F-22 squadron commanders in the Air Force. But why was he asking about passenger information? And why did his voice carry a tone she had rarely heard from him? Something approaching awe. The air traffic controller's response was cautious. Raptor lead, I cannot provide passenger information. Is there a security concern? Negative. Control. No security concern. But can you confirm if there might be any military personnel on board? Particularly retired Air Force. Now Sarah understood what was happening, and she felt a familiar mix of pride and embarrassment. Somehow, James had figured out she was on the flight. But how? The answer came with the next transmission, and it made everything clear. Control, Raptor lead requesting permission to... This is going to sound strange, but is there any chance Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, is on board that aircraft? The silence that followed was deafening, not just on the radio, but throughout the passenger cabin. The name meant nothing to most of the civilians on board, but the reverence in the F-22 pilot's voice was unmistakable. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Her quiet journey was about to become very public. The air traffic controller's response was professional, but confused. Raptor lead, I have no information about specific passengers. Can you explain the nature of your inquiry? Colonel Peterson's voice came back, and this time Sarah could hear the emotion he was trying to control. Control, if Colonel Mitchell is on board that aircraft, she was my commanding officer. One of the most distinguished fighter pilots in Air Force history. First woman to command an F-22 squadron. Call sign Phoenix. The radio crackled with responses from other pilots in the formation. Phoenix? Are you serious? The Phoenix? She's on that commercial flight. Control, Raptor 23. If that's really Phoenix on board, we need to show proper respect. Sarah kept her eyes closed, feeling the attention of nearby passengers beginning to focus on her. The tech worker beside her was staring openly now, starting to piece together what was happening. The businessman across the aisle had gone completely silent, his phone forgotten in his lap. The air traffic controller was clearly out of his depth with this unusual situation. All Raptor flights, please maintain focus on your training exercise. I cannot confirm passenger information. But Colonel Peterson was not giving up. Control, understand your limitations. But if Phoenix is on board, she should know that Raptor Squadron sends respects. She opened the door for everything we do today. More voices joined in from the F-22 formation. Phoenix paved the way for half our pilots. She wrote the book on F-22 tactics. Legend. The word legend hung in the air, transmitted clearly through the Boeing 737 speaker system to every passenger on board. Sarah opened her eyes and found that nearly everyone in her section was now looking at her. Somehow, her identity had become obvious. Jennifer, the flight attendant, approached slowly, her expression showing recognition and growing amazement. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said quietly. Are you Colonel Mitchell?" Sarah looked up at her and smiled softly. I'm retired now." The simple confirmation sent a wave of whispered conversations through the cabin. Passengers were pulling out phones, some clearly trying to look up information about Colonel Sarah Mitchell and Phoenix. Others were simply staring, trying to reconcile the quiet woman reading a paperback novel with a legendary pilot being honored by F-22 Raptors. The radio chatter continued, and now it had taken on an almost ceremonial quality. "Control, Raptor lead requesting permission to perform flyby salute for Phoenix. Raptor flights, this is Control. Negative on flyby. Civilian aircraft safety is priority. Understood, Control. But please pass message if possible. Phoenix, this is Viper leader. You taught me everything I know about flying fighters. It is an honor to share your airspace." Sarah recognized that call sign too. Viper leader was Major Lisa Rodriguez, one of the first women Sarah had trained on F-22s. Lisa had gone on to become one of the most skilled pilots in the program, and she was now leading her own training missions. The young tech worker finally found his voice. "You're really her? The Phoenix they're talking about?" Sarah nodded. "I am. What did you do? I mean, what made you so famous?" Sarah considered how to answer. How do you explain 3 decades of breaking barriers, proving skeptics wrong, and quietly revolutionizing military aviation? How do you describe being the first woman to command F-22 squadrons, to develop tactics that became standard throughout the Air Force, to earn respect in a world that had never expected women to excel in combat aviation? "I was a pilot," she said simply. "I train other pilots. I try to do my job well." The businessman leaned over. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you clearly did a lot more than that. These fighter pilots sound like they're talking about someone who changed their entire profession." Sarah smiled. "Maybe I helped open a few doors." The radio crackled again with more messages from the F-22 formation, each pilot apparently wanting to pay respects to the legendary Phoenix. The air traffic controller was struggling to maintain order while accommodating what had become an impromptu aerial tribute. "All Raptor flights, this is Control. Please maintain training exercise parameters." "Roger, Control. But please ensure Phoenix knows that Raptor Squadron considers it an honor to be in her airspace." Sarah looked out the window and, for just a moment, caught a glimpse of sunlight reflecting off something metallic in the distance. The F-22s were out there, invisible to most observers, but maintaining their respectful distance while honoring one of the pilots who had made their missions possible. As the radio chatter began to fade and the F-22s continued their exercise, Sarah found herself surrounded by fellow passengers who were seeing her with completely new eyes. The quiet woman in seat 13F had been revealed as something far more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The transformation in the aircraft cabin was immediate and profound. Word had spread from passenger to passenger that the quiet woman in seat 13F was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the legendary Phoenix, whose accomplishments had just been honored by an entire formation of F-22 Raptor pilots. What had begun as routine commercial flight had become something approaching a moving tribute. Jennifer, the flight attendant, found herself in an unprecedented situation. In 15 years of commercial aviation, she had served celebrities, politicians, and business leaders, but never had she encountered someone whose presence commanded such spontaneous respect from military pilots. She approached Sarah's seat with a mixture of professional courtesy and genuine curiosity. "Colonel Mitchell," Jennifer said quietly, "I have to ask, would you be willing to move to first class? It seems like the least we can do." Sarah shook her head gently. "That's very kind, but I'm comfortable here. I chose this seat deliberately." The tech worker beside her, who had introduced himself as David, was still processing what he had witnessed. "I've been Googling you," he said, holding up his phone. There are articles about you breaking barriers for women in combat aviation. You were the first woman to command an F-22 squadron. One of the first, Sarah corrected. There were many women who came before me and paved the way. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time when opportunities opened up. But David was reading from his phone, clearly amazed. It says here you flew over 4,000 hours in fighter aircraft, commanded 3 different squadrons, and developed training protocols that are still used today. You were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice. Sarah nodded modestly. The Distinguished Flying Cross was awarded for heroic actions during aerial combat, though she rarely discussed the missions that had earned her the recognition. Many of those operations remained classified, even years after her retirement. The businessman in the aisle seat, who had introduced himself as Robert, leaned over. Ma'am, I served in the Army in the 1990s. I remember when women were first being integrated into combat roles. There was a lot of resistance, a lot of skepticism. You must have faced incredible challenges. Everyone faces challenges, Sarah replied. The key is not letting them define your limits. But Robert pressed further. With respect, ma'am, what you accomplished was more than overcoming challenges. You changed the entire military culture. Those F-22 pilots we just heard from, some of them are probably women, right? Women who can serve in those roles because of what you proved was possible. Sarah smiled, remembering some of the exceptional female pilots she had trained over the years. Major Rodriguez, one of the pilots we heard from today, is one of the finest aviators I've ever worked with. Her gender is irrelevant to her skills in the cockpit. Captain Torres' voice came over the intercom, interrupting the conversations throughout the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I want to apologize for the radio interference you experienced earlier. We had some communication bleed from a military training exercise. Everything is normal, and we are on schedule for our arrival in Washington, D.C. He paused, then continued in a tone that was clearly unscripted. I also want to acknowledge that we have someone very special on board today. As a former military pilot myself, it is an honor to have Colonel Sarah Mitchell flying with us. Her contributions to military aviation have benefited every pilot who came after her. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Sarah felt her cheeks redden as passengers throughout the aircraft turned to look at her, many standing to show their respect. She had spent her career avoiding such public attention, preferring to let her work speak for itself. "Thank you," she said quietly, nodding to acknowledge the tribute. "But please sit down. I'm just a passenger like everyone else today." As the applause died down and passengers returned to their seats, Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way she had not experienced since her retirement ceremony. People were approaching her row, asking for photos, requesting autographs, and sharing their own military experiences or connections. A young mother traveling with her 8-year-old daughter stopped at Sarah's seat. "Colonel Mitchell, I hope you don't mind, but I wanted my daughter to meet you. Emma is fascinated by airplanes and wants to be a pilot someday." Sarah looked at the little girl, who was staring at her with wide eyes. Emma, do you like flying?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I want to fly fighter jets like you did. My mom says girls can do anything boys can do." "Your mom is absolutely right," Sarah said, smiling. "But remember, flying fighters is not about being a girl or a boy. It's about working hard, studying, training, and never giving up on your dreams. Can you promise me you'll do that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I promise." The mother thanked Sarah and moved back to her seat, but the interaction had been overheard by several passengers, and it sparked more conversations about Sarah's role in opening opportunities for future generations. David, the tech worker, had been quietly researching Sarah's background and was clearly amazed by what he was learning. "Colonel, I'm reading about some of your missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. It says you flew combat sorties in support of ground troops." Sarah nodded. "Many of us did. Combat aviation is not about individual glory. It's about supporting the mission and protecting people on the ground. But you were one of the first women to fly combat missions in fighter aircraft, right? That must have been incredibly dangerous." "All combat missions are dangerous," Sarah replied. That's why training is so important. You prepare for every possible scenario, you trust your equipment and your wingmen, and you focus on the mission. Robert, the businessman, had been listening intently. Ma'am, can I ask you something personal? When you were facing all that resistance early in your career, when people doubted whether women could handle fighter aircraft, what kept you going? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she had been asked many times over the years, and the answer had evolved as she gained perspective on her career. I think it was understanding that I was not just flying for myself, she said finally. Every mission I completed successfully, every standard I met or exceeded, every barrier I broke through, it was creating opportunities for other women who would come after me. I could not let those future pilots down by giving up when things got difficult. The conversation was interrupted by another announcement from Captain Torres. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial descent into the Washington, D.C. area. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing. As passengers settled back into their seats, Sarah reflected on how different this flight had turned out compared to what she had expected. She had hoped to travel quietly, avoiding attention, and simply getting from Seattle to Washington for the reunion she had been reluctant to attend. Instead, she had been reminded of the impact her career had on people she had never met. The F-22 pilots who had honored her over the radio, the passengers who were inspired by her story, the little girl who now had a real example that her dreams of flying fighters were possible. All of these connections had emerged from what should have been an anonymous commercial flight. Jennifer approached her seat one final time as the aircraft descended toward Reagan National Airport. Colonel Mitchell, I want to thank you for being so gracious with everyone today. I've never seen passengers so inspired by meeting someone. Thank you for taking such good care of everyone, Sarah replied. Flying should be a positive experience for everyone. Can I ask you something? Jennifer said, after everything you accomplished in the Air Force, after commanding fighter squadrons and breaking all those barriers, was it hard to retire? Do you miss it? Sarah looked out the window at the approaching lights of Washington, D.C. It was a question she had asked herself many times over the past 3 years of civilian life. I miss the flying, she said honestly. I miss the precision required, the teamwork, the sense of mission. But I don't miss the barriers I had to break or the skepticism I had to overcome. Those battles were necessary, but they were not the reason I became a pilot. As Flight 447 touched down at Reagan National Airport, Sarah gathered her simple belongings and prepared to deplane. The routine commercial flight had reminded her why her career had mattered, not just for the mission she had flown or the squadron she had commanded, but for the door she had opened for others. David, the tech worker, stood up as passengers began moving toward the exit. Colonel Mitchell, meeting you has been the highlight of my entire year. Thank you for everything you did for our country. Robert, the businessman, echoed similar sentiments. Ma'am, I serve in the Army, and I want you to know that what you accomplished changed how all of us thought about women in combat roles. You proved that excellence has no gender. As Sarah walked up the aisle toward the aircraft exit, passengers continued to thank her, shake her hand, and express their respect. Captain Torres was waiting at the cockpit door as she passed. Colonel Mitchell, he said, it was an honor having you on board. As a former Navy pilot, I know how much your career meant to all of us who serve in military aviation. Thank you, Captain. Excellent flight. Walking through the jet bridge into Reagan National Airport, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her journey had taken. She had boarded Flight 447 as a retired colonel hoping to travel anonymously. She was leaving the aircraft as Phoenix, a reminder that legends never truly retire. They just find new ways to inspire others. The reunion she was attending would be filled with other women military aviators, each with their own stories of breaking barriers and proving skeptics wrong. But today had reminded Sarah that their collective impact extended far beyond military circles. They had changed not just aviation, but society's understanding of what was possible when barriers were removed, and excellence was the only standard that mattered. As she walked through the airport toward baggage claim, Sarah smiled at the thought that tomorrow, Major Rodriguez and the other F-22 pilots would probably be telling their own squadron members about the day they shared airspace with Phoenix. The story would spread through military aviation circles, inspiring another generation of pilots to aim higher and fly farther than anyone thought possible. The quiet woman from Seat 13F had reminded everyone on Flight 447 that heroes often travel among us unrecognized, carrying decades of service and sacrifice with the same dignity they brought to their most challenging missions. Phoenix had landed, but her legend would continue to soar.